God's people in the Old Testament often being in bondage and in slavery, and they were working, right? They were enslaved to work, and that spirit didn't cease. That spirit continues even to today, where we can become enslaved to work. What the tragedy is when God becomes transactional, the Sabbath is not a motivation for us.
Welcome back to the Today Counts Show with Jim Piper. Be sure to subscribe and follow the Today Counts Show on whatever platform you watch or listen. All right, let's get back to the podcast.
Hello, everybody. We are back here at the Today Counts Show. I'm your host, Jim Piper, and I have joining me today Pastor Winston Harris and Gary Harpst, coming two very important people in my life. And we're studying the book of Genesis. We finished chapter 1 last time. And what I thought we needed to do to maybe recap that, fellas, is that we would look maybe at how the New Testament colors in Genesis 1 a little bit. And so without any further ado, I thought I would jump in here in John chapter 1. Now, we have referred to these two texts that I'm going to pull out, but I don't know that we really camped on them fully. Or the way that we could have. John 1 through 5 and 14 says this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." In our Bibles, it's a capital W. We know what that refers to, right? That refers to deity. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. Life was in him, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome or perceive it. And then verse 14 says, "The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We have observed his glory," John says, "the glory as the one and only Son from the Father." What a magnificent picture of Jesus in the book of Genesis chapter 1, in the whole Bible. Now we can say, and we know that the word in Greek is logos, and there's a lot of different ways to define that, but it's supreme being, pre-existing, depending upon whose perspective you're coming from. The Greek's perspective, the Romans' perspective, philosophers' perspective, but the soul of the world, I've heard it called the supreme being, the pre-existent one, etc. And so, of course, verse 14 is that verse that just slams it shut. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. You can't miss that. John is making an outlandish claim here that the creator of the world is Jesus, the agent, I guess you would say. In fact, I guess what I wanted to point out to begin with, guys, is, I see two clear things here. John teaches that the Word is the agent of creation because it says that all things were created through him. But it also infers or teaches us that the Word is the indispensable element in creation because of the phrase, "without him, nothing was made." So he was the agent of creation, but he was also the indispensable element. Take Jesus out of it, and we have no creation, to be even more exact. And when we looked at Genesis 1 together, we looked at the plural inference of Elohim for God, and then of course we looked also where God says, "Let us, make," right? Let us make. So I thought that was an important text to come back to and say, man, this really colors in Genesis 1 for us.
It strikes me too how that link makes you go to Colossians, where it talks about everything's held together.
Right.
I mean, I've not heard it explained the way you just did with such clarity about the dependence on creation in the first place. We know he did it, but that he's an element in it somehow. But then you add to that, it's all held together by him. It's hard to grasp it all.
Yeah, Gary, and we can kind of break it down. I know that when I'm teaching in public, I can't help but resist how to break that down to the micro. What that really means is that the three of us right now, our heartbeat, he's given us our heartbeat, our breath, he's given us our breath. Not only is he holding all the planets in place, but he keeps our heart going, keeps our lungs going. You have to take it to that place. And how do we keep from becoming worshipers and followers? We would have to absolutely reject this as fairy tale. Otherwise, what other choice, do you have but to figure out what does it mean to follow God, and then most specifically follow Christ?
Yeah, it's really good. This week at church, we were talking about worshiping God, and that we're all meant to worship something, and to worship God is to know him more, and the more you know him, the more your response is worship, to your point, Jim. And if you know him as the element of creation, right, as we're talking about, if you start to even attempt to wrap your mind and your heart around what Colossians 1 says, that the supremacy of God, Jesus is this necessary element for creation. Jesus, Genesis 1, we don't have Genesis 1 without Jesus. Then the gospel starts to come alive, right? Then when we fathom that the main ingredient, if you will, of creation actually subjected himself to ceasing to exist at some level, right? To literally dying on our behalf. Then we start to really be moved to the idea that, man, like, this, who is this Jesus that he would die for me? If he is in fact the one that is literally holding all creation together, why would he die for me? It creates this curiosity. I think that's kind of where my mind goes, is when you start to know and pursue Jesus as the one who holds creation in place, the one who Genesis 1 is, Genesis 1 and John 1 are kind of pointing us towards, then it creates a desire and a curiosity, and the gospel becomes that much more tangible for us.
Yeah, there's no way John didn't have Genesis 1:1 in his mind when he wrote, right? There's just no way. That's clearly there. I mean, yes, I believe God, the Spirit, could have given those words clean out of the air, but we know probably within a great amount of reason that he relied upon that text. The other thing that really linked up for me is I was able to link up this idea when God said, let us make man in our image and our likeness. And then the whole New Testament teaches us, through the apostles, that, if we could use the word goal, that God's goal, that our goal is that as we come into a faith relationship with Christ, it doesn't stop there, that the transformation is to become like Christ. Mm-hmm. And so here's the connection, that God's original intent is not just the physical attributes that we have, or even the immaterial attributes, that we have. When we've talked about that before, our will, our emotions, and our logic, our ability to make decisions, but also into the heart of God, the purity of God, where we want to be. We love beauty and goodness. So that's God wooing us, to himself. And the more we drink from that, the more we thirst, for that. So, that struck me. I had another thought too, is that though as believers, we talk about the world being fallen, and indeed it is, but it is still God's world. Mm-hmm. And he has redeemed it, and he is redeeming it, right? And when we step outside, well, and then we want to look at Colossians 1. Gary just mentioned, that text, and there's a few points I want to make here too before we jump into Genesis chapter 2. But in Colossians 1, now different author here, that we believe as Christians, we believe the Holy Spirit guided both of these men. It was a partnership, if you will, incarnate between John and the Spirit of God, and now between the Apostle Paul and the Spirit of God. And Paul picks up kind of right where John leaves off. It says in verse 15 of chapter 1 of Colossians, he, meaning Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, because by him everything was created in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and by him all things, here, this is Gary's point, hold together. And by him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church, another creation of God, right? He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everything to himself by making peace. And here's the mysterious part of this: through the blood of his cross, whether things on earth or things in heaven.
Yeah, I think verse 15, I have it pulled up here. The Son is the image of the invisible God. And, I can't remember the reference, but Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so when we get to, let us make man in our image, then that idea that actually Pastor Matt in our previous conversations, brought to our attention, that could it have been, God in three persons is looking forth to Jesus in the flesh, and that is the image that we bear, right, in the physical, that we weren't created. God didn't freestyle with us. He wasn't just kind of, well, let's just kind of figure this out as we go, right? Like there was already a prototype, and the prototype was God the Son. And so, yeah, that image word jumps out to me in verse 15 there in Colossians.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Hebrews 1. Let me read this to you guys real quick. I didn't really plan on doing it, but I couldn't resist. Long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. What we see here is a cooperation in the Godhead, right? There's obvious submission going on. It says in verse 3, he is the radiance. Jesus is the radiance of his God glory, the exact expression of his nature. And here we go again. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. By his powerful word. When I read the Colossians section, two things hit me. What Paul unveils is really the purpose of creation, which, according to verse 16, is for him. God created for him, for himself. That's the phrase. And that's in verse 16. And then in verse 17, he talks about the perpetuation of creation, in that in him he holds all things together. So, I mean, a lot of times, I hear people say that probably the most important decision that we could make in our life is to decide who Jesus is. And I just don't want to leave Genesis 1 in the dust without bringing together the new revelation, the New Testament, and marrying that to, Genesis 1 is a beautiful chapter to study and to give oneself to. in and of itself. But then that we have the New Testament that colors it in, and again God reveals more of himself to us. Just a very powerful thing. So I thought those were important to talk about. Any more thoughts that you guys have on Genesis 1 before we turn the page? Not that we're going to leave Genesis 1 in the dust, because I know we'll come back to it.
Well, one thing, I was reading some Os Guinness work, and he actually referenced another rabbi. I don't remember who it was, but he made the distinction that for whatever reason, God really chose to reveal himself primarily in the Old Testament with the spoken word, not with sights, not things you can see or touch or smell, but the word. And, the word is such a creative force. I mean, he created the universe by speaking it into existence. And it just caused me to think about how I say something to you or you say something to me. It starts a whole thinking process. You put an idea in the mind of somebody and it starts to create action and take a shape. And so words are creative. And then once you create something, you can see it. And it's so interesting that in the New Testament, he actually revealed himself as something we can see and touch, which is Jesus. And we long to see, we long to use all of our senses. And I don't know, I just appreciate your focus all through every verse we talked about. The word is the thing. Anyway, so I appreciate it's just mysterious and beautiful.
Yeah, all at the same time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's turn the page, and if we need to go back to Genesis 1 at any time, we will, won't we? Genesis 1, I mean. So I think, Winston, you're going to read. Today we're looking at rest, and God having this creative process of 6 days, but yet kind of includes this seventh day, and there's actually a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, we'll jump in Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, reading out of the NLT, and we'll hop in. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation.
But when, the first word that jumped out to me was complete. Complete. Completed. Completion. Complete. And I've been doing some thinking about that a lot this week, philosophically, historically, even in seasons, in my life, there does seem to be some chapters that close and open. I don't think these verses are as loose as that, but it did get my mind, moving. And then, just revisiting this whole thing of rest is has been kind of a big deal for me over the last couple of weeks. I don't know where you guys are at, but of course, when I look at the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, and, I'm reminded the first 4 of the 10 Commandments are commandments that deal with our vertical relationship, with God. And then the following 6 deal with more of our horizontal relationship, with one another. At least that appears to be the structure. And the 4th commandment is, remember to dedicate the Sabbath day. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work. Obviously, this is in a day where God is giving law and even more order. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the foreigner who happens to be, inside your gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath and declared it holy. And Hebrews 4 spends a lot of time unpacking this whole thing. So, this might be a bigger deal than the Western mind, thinks about Western culture. Thinks about. I don't know what you guys have wrestled with, but I've got all kinds of notes scratched and some convictions that have kind of got squeezed out of this.
Yeah, I think one of the voices of culture that is pretty prominent in 2024 is the voice of self-care, of creating boundaries, of kind of protecting your time, protecting your energy, and it kind of masks itself as caring about rest, but it's definitely not biblical in spirit. There's this desire to care for oneself, but at the end of the day, it is a selfish spirit, right? The result of the cultural voice of self-care is just a temporary relief of pain and stress, but it doesn't actually deal with the real issue, which is me. I'm the issue, and there's this biblical model that God is setting forth in Genesis 2, this rhythm, if you will, that I think when we get down to it, if we practice this rhythm of working and then resting, it actually creates margin within our life, emotionally, internally, mentally, emotionally, to recognize that there is not enough in me to address and actually care for myself. I can't in my own power address, the issues and the tensions and the problems. And so the beauty of this rhythm that God is setting forth is that this resting, this intermission gives me perspective that I need something beyond myself to actually truly find rest. I can't find rest in my own natural efforts in these cultural practices of, okay, I have to I can only act my wage. That there's a statement out there in the workforce where no longer are we going the extra mile or showing up early or staying late, but I'm only going to do the bare minimum because I have to watch out for myself. I have to care for myself. I'm not caring for the organization or the team. I'm not people-centered. I'm self-centered. And there's this, spirit of, I don't want to get taken advantage of, which is also interesting because the gospel says I'm going to give myself up. I'm going to lay my life down just as my Savior laid his life down for me. And so I think wrapped up in all of this idea of rest, there is a false rest that the world offers us, and then there is a fullness and true rest that we find in Christ, in the gospel, and God is starting to set forth that rhythm in Genesis 2.
That I really like the way you said that. I whenever I hear the word holy, it reinforces what you're saying, I believe, Pastor. If you look at the word holy, there's sort of a natural reaction to that being, not natural, but a sort of a church reaction to being something not common, it's special, but we think about God's holiness. But if you really look at the pattern, only God can declare something holy. I can't. I mean, if you look in Scripture, if something's holy, He's the one who says it's holy, and it always means it's serving His purpose. So you had objects, tables in the tabernacle that He said this is holy, and it really was. I said, well, what does He mean by that? And you begin to realize, well, when He declares something to have a purpose and it's living in the purpose that He declared it for, it's holy. And so you think, okay, that He said the Sabbath has a purpose, and that's what ties in so much to what you just said. And the New Testament puts a bookend on that where it says the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. And, if you look at the other 6 days of creation, everything there provided for us. He gave us land and sea and animals and food and light and, rest. He gave us all those things. And then the 6th day is no less a provision for us. It, it has every bit as much purpose as the rest. I think you already alluded to this, Jim, or maybe you did it in the prep notes, but the idea that it's the only one that doesn't have an end yet. There's no end. No, the others say there was more evening and then there was morning, the 5th day or the 6th day. That's not stated for the rest.
Right.
It's ongoing. We're still in it.
Yeah, when I think about rest, I think about other synonyms like trust, giving up, surrendering. I'm wrestling with this because, God has clearly engineered some things, and He's taught us about those things. And Gary, as you quoted Jesus' words that, the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. And what a loving, instructing statement that is. So then what do we do with that candy bar? We just stack them up and we eat them until it puts us into obesity, and then we claim grace. We just really struggle with grace. I mean, on one hand, we don't get grace. We're trying to still earn stuff. On the other hand, we tend to frustrate grace. And, even today, people are deconstructing the faith. And when you examine them, what they're going to say is they're destructing bad men and what bad men did. But once you peel back the onion, that's not what's going on. What's going on is I want to take God's engineering and apply it my own way.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say that I need to get into a better position of the Sabbath. God has given that for me, and being a guy who is driven and doing when I read through Hebrews 4, which we're not going to do today because it's somewhat cumbersome, has a lot of historicity to it, and takes a lot of unpacking. But it's really clear that in the relationship between God and Israel, that the Lord was pretty disappointed and upset with the fact that the people wouldn't trust him. And that's what I meant by rest, because Hebrews 4 uses the term rest in context with the Sabbath. But as you read it, and if it was like an orange, you could just squeeze it. And really what it comes out to is you just don't trust. You just don't trust to rest in God. As I was wrestling with this text, there was 4 things that I kind of squeezed out of it. One is, as I said earlier, this text seems to say, knock it off. I've completed this thing. Take some time to enjoy it, to be in the wonder of it, and to take it a step further. So that's the first thing. This is that he clearly sanctified it. He clearly set it apart. And I mean, it's almost as though it's part of creation, but not part of creation. It's I can't explain it this way, but as Gary said, he made it holy. Well, no kidding. Now it's a 4th commandment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's one of the top 10 hits of God. It's one of the top 10. And so man, and then getting back to Gary's quote of Jesus, yeah, it's probably doesn't have to happen on a Saturday or a Sunday. But if we're more driven to rewrite the script than we are to, just learn what it means to rest, that's a problem. So anyway, he clearly set it apart. The third thing that I got out of this, though, too, is that God is not rushed. He's not stressed out. He doesn't have this big task list of things that have to get done. So symbolically, he's saying everything's under control. I didn't create chaos. I put things in order. The sun's going to come up in the morning. So the third thing I pulled out is it's symbolic of what he has done. Will you sit and rest and with me?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested, Winston, what I'm going to confess something here. as a person that has always dedicated Sundays to worship, but the games you end up playing. I know when we were raising our kids, there was a lot of pressure to play sports on Sunday, and I'd have these debates with other families and with myself and in our own family where I'd say, or people would say, well, we can go to church in the morning and go to the game in the afternoon. By the way, to your listeners, I'm not trying to step on anybody's toes here. I'm just working through how I had to think about this. And I began to realize that part of the language of Sabbath is ceasing. You cease. There's all during the week, you alluded to this, Jim, we're driven people. If I'm plowing a field, I'm focused on plowing that field. And so all during the week, I'm focused on doing things that need to be done. And what I found was, yes, on Sunday, if I go to a ball game in the afternoon, you got 3 kids, or my son's got 4 kids, I may have ceased doing work, but I have not ceased with a schedule and a mindset of, I got to get these kids out the door. We got to get out of the church. We leave 5 minutes early, rush to here. It feels just like the rest of the week.
Yeah.
It may be a different kind of work, and we're not working, but the parents don't feel that way. I mean, they're frantic just like they are during the week. And we had to consciously say, what are we trying to do with Sunday? And it's more than just attending the service. It's ceasing, it's breaking, it's having time to renew our mind and our heart and quit thinking about the things we think about during the week. I'm preaching myself here, but
I mean, I'm going to jump ahead of Winston. He can jump in too. I think that for me, I use a thing called a playbook. It's something that I invented decades ago that helps me think about life. And, I've got a playbook that's more of a personal constitution than it is anything else. And then I have another playbook that's more of an action plan. I guess is the way I would do it. And one of the things that I've noticed is that I've got to ask myself these questions every week. Every week. And yeah, when I was raising kids, there was wrestling, soccer, cheerleading, and the world doesn't cater to my faith. The world doesn't cater to that. It doesn't. And, the other thing I was going to say is that, God created, but God doesn't labor like we labor. He governs. And so when he stopped deliberately to set an example for us to do that. And I think it has become, we live in a 24/7 society. And I think that if somebody really does want to follow Christ and enjoy the fellowship of Christ, I think this is a big deal. And we're not going to tell our kids, I don't think, that they can't play ball, but at the same time, we have to have conversations about it. And what does a Sabbath look like for us, I don't know about you guys, but if I have a consistent Sabbath, and there's a big if there, if I have a consistent Sabbath, it would be Saturday. And I just noticed that in my rhythm of life, when Saturday comes, I sense a rest. Now, I still have the ability to throw a grenade in it.
Or your wife does.
Or my wife does. But we've been good at setting different practical rules to help us. And in my new stage in life, season in life, it does seem like Saturday is the opportunity that I have to do that. But even as fans, I mean, it's not just the kids in sports, but you're playing fantasy football now. And I mean, when do you ever shut the brain off? I don't know. Now Winston's daughter's a little too young at this point, but Winston, you played ball your whole life. You were a very successful basketball player. You played in college as well. And I don't know what your walk with God was like during those times, but did you encounter, back to Gary's question, I think people that are listening to this podcast right now are going, oh, wow, how do we navigate this? We can't just leave this out there in the neutral.
Yeah, I think it's, especially in 2024, trying to identify a formal 24 hours of ceasing to create, ceasing to live, if you will, seems almost, impossible. And, where I come to is, this, I've heard this, I don't know who's coined this, phrase, but that we don't rest from work, we rest for work. And so the idea is then that, we don't work 6 days and then we rest. We rest, we start and rest. So like when Adam was created, we don't know the exact time frame, but we could say potentially that Adam's first day was actually the seventh day, the day of rest, that his first day was resting with God, that Adam started in rest and then went into the next, week, or, however you want to break that time frame down. And what I'm getting at is at some point, do we identify and understand that? And if this is heretical, please reel me back in. But if Christ is the fulfillment, right? If he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, and now the law is to love God and love people, when we are in relationship with him, that's where true rest is. And so true rest is consistently accessible in relationship and in rhythm with Christ. And now I'll come back to that word rhythm, because we see this rhythm set forth in Genesis and then in Matthew 11:28. I love the Message version of this. I'll just read this real briefly. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me and get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. So I love that language in this paraphrase, not translation, but in this paraphrase, because there is a rhythm, there is a work, necessary work. We can't get away from work. We need work. That's the principle. But he says, watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. And so where I'm going is within all that we have to manage, all that we have to walk through, that there are opportunities, pockets, if you will, of rest accessible if we are consistently attuned, consistently aware that rest is available in relationship with Christ. I'm driving on my way to work. No, this is not a formal day of Sabbath, but Christ is the Sabbath. Christ is the fullness and the fulfillment of rest. And so I could get more rest in 2 minutes of praying to Jesus than I could in a formal, rigid, obligatory, I'm not going to do anything for 24 hours and come out of that because my heart wasn't in that. And I'm just as tired as I was, just working throughout the week, right? And so I can be rested when I'm truly trusting in Christ, walking with Christ, living in Christ day to day. as opposed to just fixating on trying to carve out 24 hours of ceasing creatively, if you will. So,
yeah, let me jump in there, and I'm not going to push back, although I'm going to wave some flags. And this is kind of where I hope we would get in this, because I think it needs to be talked about. I think that it's darn clear that Jesus fulfilled the law, and sometimes some people call that the time that we live in the age of grace, right? It's so we've been set free from the law, and those wonderful Hebrew people, they took this fourth commandment and they say, well, what does that actually, how do I know when I'm fulfilling the Sabbath and when I'm not? So now they had to make more rules, and before they had Fitbits, they kind of counted steps. I mean, the Fitbit started because of the fourth commandment, and they started counting steps. They were adding all these measurements to it, and there is no way you could feel rest when you were looking over your shoulder, worried that you were going to break the commandment and have a Pharisee look down their nose at you. So there's that, right? There's definitely that. But my warning to all of us, and if there's a Sabbath breaker, and if you're watching this and I'm talking, well, you're looking at a Sabbath breaker. So, but my conviction in studying this, I've got a little bit of a revival going on, okay, let me read this again. It says, so the form God gives, it says, you are to labor 6 days. On the seventh, it's a stinking Sabbath. It seems pretty clear to me that these are the engineering and I might say, well, God, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 2 hours every day, and that'll add up to a more than a working day. And that's how I'm going to do, my Sabbath. And I mean, if that's possible, I don't think I would argue with it. I think that what is built into this commandment is God's knowledge of how he made us. So I guess I agree in spirit to what you're saying, Winston, but I know for me, I think that works for a while, and I think that grace is there for a while, but sooner or later, it's kind of like, I just think of what I do before I go on vacation. I'm an idiot. Because I want to be free from anxiety on my vacation. I don't want to have any pending issues. So I slave myself to death for the 3 weeks leading up to it. And so when I go on vacation, I am spent, I am done, I am exhausted. And it takes me 3 or 4 days just to say, where am I? Oh, okay. Now I'm on vacation. So I don't know. I mean,
Jim, I want to add something to, I think it's both and I mean, I think what you're describing, Winston, is the living in the moment. We have to walk in the Spirit moment by moment, and there's peace and a rest in there that can't come any other way. But I'm a systems guy. You've heard that, and technology and all that stuff.
We were waiting for it.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. When it comes to groups, there's a group dynamic that if in a single family you don't agree that the Sabbath is here, then you got one person taking the Sabbath on Monday, one taking on Tuesday, somebody 2 hours here, and you cannot have the benefit of the synergy of everybody Sabbathing at the same time. Good. It's like saying anybody eat whenever they want to, as opposed to dinner is at 6 o'clock. And I'm old enough, believe it or not, in Ohio at least, there was something called the Blue Laws until 1960. Businesses couldn't be open on Sunday. And it sounds like legislating morality, and I get it. I mean, I understand why that we moved away from it. But society lost something because now businesses have to be open 7 days a week, or they lose business to somebody else. If all the businesses would say we're not opening on Sunday, they'd have the same amount of business, and they'd do it in 6 days instead of 7. And so it's not a faith-based thing; it's a wisdom thing. You see what I mean? And that's what you're getting at, Jim. God is wise. He gives us stuff that is not just holy, but it's purposeful. And anyway.
and maybe there's a community aspect to it as well.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, our community would be healthier if they knew everybody could stay home on Sunday and go to church and do whatever they wanted and not have to worry about being open. So anyway, that's my systems input to this whole thing.
So how do we practice this commandment while living in the culture that we live in, right? Do we just pull out and become Amish, in that way? Nothing against the Amish folk.
Legalistic.
Legalistic. And that's to Winston's thinking, right? I mean, so I think, I think
talk about it.
Yeah.
I think get your kids together, have a family meeting and say, let's talk about what the purpose of Sabbath is. Let's talk about real life. How do we do this together? And come up with your own set of rules. But at least they're learning to integrate their belief system and their faith in God with their life and not draw legalistic lines.
And just like with our health, our body talks to us. Does it not? And I think the reason why Saturdays are becoming, Sabbath-like, I'm not going to say that it is yet, but I could feel it. And I started communicating it to my wife. Now, again, we don't have kids with us anymore. So, those listening might say, well, that's easy, for you to say. And I think, yep, you're right. It is easier for me to say. But I could tell that as Friday is coming to a close, I am thirsting for this day of rest. And Sunday's not it. Not in my world. Sunday's not it. I don't know. I mean, is this Sunday work for you, Winston?
No, especially because I'm in the ministry, so Sundays are definitely what I would consider a work day. And for anybody listening, don't get me wrong, Fridays are, as a family, our Sabbath. But just for some context, so I grew up Seventh-day Adventist predominantly. Well, both Seventh-day Adventist and Pentecostal, I saw both sides. But probably in practice, specifically when it comes to the Sabbath, that culture was in our household. So literally from, I think I want to say it was Friday. Now I'm trying to draw a blank, but let's just say Friday. We would literally not do anything. Probably throughout even my high school years. At some point, maybe 10th or 11th grade, I kind of got freedom to make my own decision. But, from childhood on, Fridays were no TV, no shopping, really didn't even leave the house. I just remember sleeping a lot. I would read the Bible sometimes, but so I can see it from that angle, not maybe to that extreme. But I can see how you could set aside a day and not come out of that day rested because you didn't have a heart connection to it. You didn't have a relationship that motivated you to be moved to do that. And I can see how, on the flip side, the other way, right, where if there's no distinction about what and how you live out the principle and the rhythm of Sabbath, it can get messy, it can get confusing, and you can actually not have a rhythm, right? You're not actually creating a rhythm. So I definitely think it's both and I can see both sides. And for my family, Friday is a Sabbath. Sunday is definitely not a Sabbath. But I think I think about the times in Scripture where Jesus and his disciples were quote unquote working on what the law said was a Sabbath, and Jesus was trying to get them to see that once again the Sabbath was made for men not made for the Sabbath. And so there's that constant tension that we are to wrestle with.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. It is a tension. And for me, and maybe we should have dived into this faster, because I think this is probably a bigger deal than we realize. The more we talk about it, now while I was very carefully listening to you, I sensed these thoughts in my mind. I said, well, no, wait a second. If we start making rules around the Sabbath, don't we just put ourselves back into bondage? Because now we're so worried about how we do that. Yet, I think where Christians make a mistake is that all of these laws that God has given us that are referred to in Psalm 1, these are good. These are good. Now, man has a tendency to corrupt things in our fallen state, but in its original delivery, I don't think they have moved away from good and beautiful. Let me make a point here. We've been talking recently, both personally, you and I, in our church community, even here on this podcast, about this agricultural term, sowing and reaping what you sow. So I just, in my mind, revisited the 10 Commandments. And one of those is, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. In America, we just call it lying, just short for lying. So I don't think that any cognitive believer would say, well, that's the old law. Now we can lie because we're under the grace of God. And yet, if someone lies to you, you're pretty, you, meaning not you, Winston, you, human being, whoever you are, you take a step back, and the first thing that happens to you is you're going, I don't know if I can really trust this person if there's not some kind of a quick confession to this. Granted, everybody has probably lied, and we often do that out of insecurity. So the first thing we need to recognize is our insecurity, but then confess that lie and get right with that person that we offended, that we lied to. And if we don't do that, if we don't live that kind of a lifestyle, we are sowing these seeds where people are going to say, we don't have anything to do with you. So what I'm trying to figure out is, I don't think you can differentiate between one commandment and the other. And now, again, I think we learn the spirit of these commandments, and to Gary's point, we do need to talk about it and have discernment about it. So let's just say you go 14 days in a row of working. Does that make you a bad believer? I don't think that's what we're saying, right? Because I think that's what Jesus set straight. He said, wait a second. God rested on the seventh. And one of the reasons why is not just because it was complete, not just so that he would sanctify it, not just so that it's a symbol of order and harmony, but he theologically, the implication here is that he deliberately set it as an example, knowing that he created humanity in that rhythm. So we're simply just hurting ourselves. So even though, baseball and basketball and soccer and all of these other things and raising a family have a way of inserting themselves wherever, but I think that as believers, we can be honest enough, good enough, beautiful enough to say, well, how do we practice a Sabbath this week? And sometimes it might look like that kind of a conversation. How do we do it this month? Wow, look at our calendar this month. Boy, if we don't pay attention to resting, what are we going to look like at the end of the month? So it does get pretty practical, but I don't think resting simply means take a nap. I also think it means to enjoy God's creation, enjoy God himself. As we even, a lot of us, wouldn't you say, even have to learn what that means? What does that even look like? How do you enjoy God?
Yeah, I mean, I had been in Psalms 37 and 4, got stuck there. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And, that this can be integrated, into this conversation, in that I don't even know that we know how to delight in the Lord oftentimes, and we, gravitate towards delight being this feel good. Everything has to be just right. God has got to give me what I want. I need to be happy. And delight is actually a decision to be satisfied, irregardless of the circumstance.
To
and
be
so
content
carry that
and grateful
energy into this Sabbath practice, where I'm going to determine or decide that there is going to be rest, no matter what the circumstances are, that I'm going to have to fight for it. I'm going to have to plan for it. I'm going to have to make this a culture of my home or of my life. And it may look different, but I'm still going to choose to exercise. I'm still going to choose to practice this. This is going to be a rhythm. I'm not going to wait until I'm sick or I'm injured or, I'm burnt out. But this is going to be a decision. No matter what's going to happen, I'm going to make time to cease from creating. And that is a form of delight. I am making a decision. I'm not waiting till I'm happy, or I'm waiting till I'm needing this, right? I'm going to make a decision. And what comes out of that time is, fruit, right? And I think you could even draw a parallel to Galatians.
That's so true.
When we talk about, the fruit of the Spirit, one, that's not necessarily an exhaustive list, but you don't, it's a cluster fruit, right? I don't just get more patience or more kindness. It is all embodied together. And you kind of just alluded to that, right? Where do I get the fruit from? I get the fruit from relationship with Christ. When I'm in relationship with him, the byproduct is the fruit. When I'm in relationship with Christ, when I determine and decide to be in relationship with him, and I practice and exercise the Sabbath, the byproduct is rest.
Well, let's take, for example, what happened this week. And you know about it because I sent you out an SOS. So, last week from Tuesday through Thursday, I was in Miami, or at least trying to get to Miami and in Miami. And, Monday was a day of work. And you picked me up at the airport Friday morning. I think it was around 1:30. All I know is I didn't get into the house until 2 a.m. on Friday. And so on Friday, I had a lot of unfinished business. And I was physically exhausted and I was emotionally exhausted. And I made a decision on Friday morning. Well, I actually had a couple of appointments. I had a contractor come by the house Friday morning, and then I had physical therapy for my shoulder replacement on Friday. And I think that ended 10:30 in the morning. And when I came home from that, I told Rhonda, I said, this is a day of rest. So if you would have peeked into my home office on late Friday morning, it would have looked like something you have never seen me do. I mean, it was just stacks of stuff all over. And I just turned my head. I said, I'm not even going to look at it. I'm not even going to think about it. And we had a very relaxing day, together. And believe it or not, by the time Saturday about mid-morning came around, I felt rested spiritually, emotionally, and physically. Sometimes you need more than that. I tend to be pretty resilient, and but you just never know, what a week has in store. So we don't want to be legalistic, but it does need something that we think about and we talk about. And if you think about it, if this is the fourth commandment and we want to honor God with our lives, this is a big, it's a big deal. Like I said, if it got into the top 10, it's got to be big. it's got to be a big deal. So anyway, going through this for me, Winston, is I realize that I have probably slipped in the sloppiness when it comes to being intentional about what a Sabbath, means. And the way back may not be super easy, but these verses, when we took these verses and we looked at them, and then we cross-referenced them and realized, oh gosh, this is the fourth commandment. Oh wow, Hebrews 4 talks in length, about this. And thank you, Jesus, for letting us understand the motive of it, that he did it for us. When you put all that together, you go, okay, this is a leadership issue in our homes and a self-leadership issue in our lives.
Yeah, if I have any lasting thoughts, you think about God's people in the Old Testament often being in bondage and in slavery, and they were working, right? They were enslaved to work, and that spirit didn't cease. That spirit continues even to today, where we can become enslaved to work, and through the Sabbath practice, through relationship with Jesus. What the tragedy is when God becomes transactional, the Sabbath is not a motivation for us.
Yeah, well, that's a good. That's a good. And what's cool is from this conversation we move into Genesis 2 verses 4 and on, where we're going to be looking at man and woman in the garden, and we're going to get into more detail as we explore how it was supposed to be, and then what actually happens in Genesis chapter 3. So I'm excited about getting into that discussion. I think it's going to be very helpful for everyone who is participating. Winston, thanks for joining us. Gary had to jump off a little early, but that was a good conversation about the Sabbath.
Yeah, thanks for having me.